For years, Officers Holloway and Mercer ruled their streets without fear, knowing the system would always protect them. When they stopped Natalie during her morning jog, they saw just another black woman to intimidate, another easy target. They didn't see a Navy SEAL, a woman trained to dismantle threats, to endure, to fight back. They tased her, cuffed her, and warned her to stay in her place. Now, the same men who once walked with power are the ones looking over their shoulders. Their lives are unraveling, their fear mounting, and the control they once wielded is slipping away. Because Natalie doesn't want justice. She wants them to feel what they put her through. And by the time she's done, they'll know exactly what happens when you push the wrong person. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The rhythmic sound of Natalie Simmons's running shoes striking the pavement echoed softly in the stillness of the early morning. Each step was controlled, steady. A measured pace that allowed her thoughts to drift, while her body moved instinctively, her breath sinking with the cadence of her stride. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, porch lights still glowing dimly against the haze of dawn, sprinklers hissing in automated precision, the occasional rumble of a garage door opening as someone prepared to leave for work. The air smelled of damp grass and fresh earth, the residue of a cool night fading beneath the slow warmth of the rising sun. She had chosen this neighborhood for its quiet, for its predictability, for the simple peace of living somewhere that didn't demand constant vigilance. After years of war, of moving through environments where every shadow could conceal a threat, where every footstep had to be carefully placed, she had wanted something different, something normal. But even as she ran, feeling the smooth rhythm of her body propelling forward, the ingrained habits of her training never fully faded. She noticed the subtle shifts in the environment around her. The car that had been idling too long at a stop sign 2 blocks back. The curtain that twitched slightly as she passed a house where she had never seen the occupants before. The distinct change in sound as an engine rumbled into motion. Behind her, too slow to be natural, too deliberate to be anything but intentional. The moment she heard the creeping roll of tires coming up alongside her, she knew. She didn't stop running immediately, but she adjusted her pace, breathing evenly as she turned her head slightly to glance at the vehicle without fully acknowledging it. A police cruiser, its blue and white markings unmistakable, moving just a little too closely. Just slow enough to feel like something other than routine patrol. She kept her focus forward, muscles coiled beneath the surface, resisting the instinct to react too soon. Then the voice came, cutting through the quiet like a blade against glass. "Hey! Stop right there." Natalie exhaled slowly, letting her stride come to a natural halt, her heartbeat steady as she turned to face them. The cruiser door opened with a mechanical groan, and the 2 officers stepped out, their presence heavy with unspoken authority. Both were white. One older, broad-shouldered with graying hair beneath his cap, his movements slow, methodical, the weight of years in uniform shaping his posture. The other was younger, leaner, with a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth, the kind of expression that suggested he enjoyed moments like this. The older officer shifted his belt slightly, his hand brushing the holster at his hip, a movement that could be casual but wasn't. "What are you doing out here?" His voice was flat, the kind of tone that wasn't really asking, just demanding confirmation of what he had already decided. Natalie wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, inhaling calmly before meeting his gaze with steady control. "Jogging." The younger one let out a small scoff, shaking his head as he glanced at his partner. "Jogging, huh? That's funny. We got a call about a suspicious person moving through the neighborhood." The words settled in the air between them, weighted, intentional. Suspicious person. A broad enough phrase to be used whenever it was convenient, vague enough to justify anything they wanted. Natalie let a slow breath expand in her chest, her muscles still relaxed, her expression unreadable. Suspicious? How? The older officer tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to entertain her question. "Didn't say. Just that someone was moving between houses. Seemed out of place." Her jaw tightened, but she kept her voice smooth, unshaken. "I live here." The younger one gave a slow nod, the smirk still lingering as he crossed his arms. "Sure you do. You got ID on you?" Natalie didn't flinch. She had expected this. She had played out this scenario in her mind too many times, not because she wanted to, but because it was a necessary part of survival. "I don't carry ID when I run," she said, keeping her voice even, giving them nothing to latch onto. The older officer sighed through his nose, his gaze flicking over her, assessing in a way that had nothing to do with verifying her words and everything to do with searching for a reason to escalate. "That's convenient," he muttered, not bothering to hide the doubt in his tone. Natalie stayed quiet, letting them sit in the silence, refusing to give them the reaction they were looking for. The younger cop, growing impatient, took a small step forward. "So, let me guess, you live just a few blocks away, right? Nice house, good job." The way he said it, the mocking edge in his voice, made it clear what he thought of that possibility. She didn't react, didn't rise to the bait. The older officer adjusted his stance, giving a small, almost performative shrug. "Thing is, we don't see you around much. And people in this neighborhood, they notice when someone doesn't belong." There it was. The real reason. Natalie exhaled slowly, the control in her voice like iron beneath silk. "I belong here." The younger cop let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah? Prove it." She didn't look away, didn't shift, didn't offer an inch of ground. "Am I being detained?" The moment stretched, heavy with the kind of tension that didn't just come from this interaction, but from a lifetime of moments just like this, from a history that had repeated itself too many times in too many places. The older officer took just a second too long to answer. Then, finally, his jaw tightened, and he gave a small shake of his head. "Not yet." The words weren't reassurance. They were a warning. Natalie could feel the heat of the sun rising behind her, the golden light stretching long shadows across the pavement, casting the three of them in sharp contrast. A few houses down, an elderly couple had paused near their driveway, pretending not to watch. A man watering his lawn had turned slightly, not enough to seem interested, but enough to see. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being put on display. The younger officer shifted his weight, his fingers drifting just slightly closer to his belt. A movement that was meant to be seen, meant to send a message. This wasn't about suspicion, it was about control. The older officer's voice cut through the thick air. "Look, you cooperate, and we'll be on our way. Just trying to do our job." Natalie held his gaze, her body still, her breath even. She could have played along, could have nodded, smiled, made them feel like they had won so they would let her go. But she was tired of playing that game. The younger cop exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Come on, lady. Let's not make this difficult." His hand moved again, closer to his belt, his body angling slightly, his muscles tightening in a way that only someone trained to recognize aggression would see. Natalie didn't move, but inside, something shifted. The weight of war settled back into her bones. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Natalie stood her ground, her breath steady, her posture relaxed but deliberate. She had faced down warlords and insurgents in foreign countries, had trained in environments where hesitation meant death, had survived missions where the odds were never in her favor. This moment, standing on a quiet suburban street, with two overzealous cops looking for an excuse, was different, but not unfamiliar. The younger officer, now clearly agitated, had lost the smirk he wore earlier. His posture had changed, shoulders squared, stance widening just slightly, the kind of shift that signaled an escalation. He wasn't just waiting for compliance anymore. He was waiting for defiance. The older officer, though quieter, was no less dangerous. Natalie could tell he was the one making the real decision. His patience thin, but his control still intact. "You're making this harder than it has to be," the younger one said, shifting his weight as his fingers lingered a little too close to his belt. "Just answer the damn questions and stop acting like you've got something to hide." Natalie exhaled slowly, keeping her hands in view, knowing full well how quickly they could turn a simple conversation into something far worse. "I've already answered your questions," she said, her voice smooth, unwavering. "I told you. I live here. I was out for a run. That's not a crime." The older officer's jaw clenched slightly. "You're refusing to show identification." "I told you. I don't carry ID when I run," she repeated, keeping her tone even, controlled. The younger one let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head. "See? This is the problem," he muttered, stepping closer. "People like you—" His words cut off as the older officer raised a hand, stopping him. There was no real concern in his face, only calculation. He was weighing the situation, deciding how far they could push before they had to back off. His gaze flicked down the street, noticing the subtle attention they were drawing. The elderly couple in their driveway, the man with the hose still watering his already drenched lawn, the silhouettes shifting behind nearby windows. They didn't like an audience, but they weren't about to let her walk away either. The older officer turned his attention back to her, sighing through his nose. "All right," he said, voice deceptively casual. "Let's make this easy. Turn around, hands on your head." Natalie's fingers curled slightly, the first flicker of fire heating beneath her skin. "What's the charge?" "You're obstructing an investigation," he replied, his expression unreadable. "We're detaining you until we can verify your identity." Detaining, not arresting, not charging, just taking her in, removing her from the street, making sure she knew exactly where she stood. The younger officer's smirk returned. "Unless you want to resist," he added, his hand now resting fully on his belt, fingers grazing the handle of his taser. Natalie knew how this worked. If she complied, they'd parade her through booking, humiliate her, make sure the neighborhood saw her in handcuffs. If she resisted, even in the slightest way, they'd escalate, claim she was a threat, use force. Either way, they got what they wanted. Dominance, control, power. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing calm, even as her body tensed with the instinct to fight back. But she wasn't stupid. She wasn't reckless. "I'm not resisting," she said, lifting her hands slightly but making no move to turn. "I'm asking what authority you have to detain me without cause." The older officer's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Last chance." She didn't move. The younger officer scoffed, shaking his head. "This is what I was talking about. I told you she was casing houses." The older officer nodded slightly, as if convincing himself. "Yeah." And refusing to cooperate. Natalie clenched her teeth. This was a game to them, a performance, one designed to justify whatever they had already decided they were going to do. The older officer lifted his radio to his mouth. "Dispatch. We've got a possible suspect refusing to cooperate. Send additional units." Natalie's jaw tightened as she heard the faint crackle of the radio in response. They were calling for backup, not because they needed it, but because they wanted to escalate, wanted to turn a simple stop into a public spectacle. It didn't take long. Within minutes, another cruiser turned the corner, its lights flashing, though no sirens sounded. Another officer stepped out, and she could feel the shift in the air, the way the situation had officially transformed from an unjustified stop to something more dangerous. She could hear a door creak open nearby. Someone was recording. Good. She could hear the backup officer's voice as he approached. "What's the situation?" The older officer didn't even hesitate before replying. "Possible suspect for casing houses. Won't provide ID. Won't cooperate." A lie. Delivered effortlessly. The backup officer nodded, his hand already resting on his holster as he took position behind the others. Natalie took a slow breath. "I told you. I live here." The younger officer scoffed. "Then why are you being so difficult?" Her voice was like steel. "Because I know my rights." There was a flicker of something in the older officer's face. Annoyance, impatience, maybe even amusement at her defiance. Then, before she could process his next move, the younger officer's hand darted to his taser. She saw it just a fraction of a second before he fired. The sharp pop of the electrodes firing rang out through the street. A searing bolt of electricity tore through her body. locking her muscles in place as white-hot pain exploded through her limbs. Her knees buckled. Her breath left her in a choked, involuntary gasp, her body hitting the pavement hard. The world blurred around the edges, the asphalt rough beneath her cheek, the scent of burned ozone thick in the air. Distantly, she heard voices. "Get her hands! Stop resisting!" Hands grabbed at her, yanking her arms behind her back, forcing them into steel restraints. Her vision swam as she sucked in air, the lingering current still making her limbs tremble. Even through the haze, she could hear the murmurs of neighbors, the mechanical clicks of phones recording, the scattered voices whispering words she couldn't quite make out. She hadn't resisted, and still, here she was, face down on the pavement, hands in cuffs, being dragged into the back of a police cruiser for no reason other than existing in a neighborhood they didn't believe she belonged in. The pavement was rough beneath Natalie's cheek, the sting of the taser still rippling through her limbs like an aftershock. She focused on her breathing, keeping it steady even as her muscles twitched involuntarily from the residual charge. The weight of a knee pressed into her back, shoving her harder against the ground, her arms wrenched behind her, metal cuffs biting into her wrists. She could hear them muttering above her, their words clipped, movements rehearsed, a well-oiled machine executing the steps they had done countless times before. "Stop resisting!" She wasn't resisting. She hadn't moved since they had taken her down, her body still sluggish from the voltage tearing through her nervous system. But that phrase, "stop resisting," was for the crowd now gathering, for the bystanders who had emerged from their homes, drawn by flashing lights and raised voices. It was a line meant to justify everything they were doing. A murmur rippled through the growing audience. Neighbors, early risers, people who had been drinking coffee in their kitchens and stepped outside when they heard the commotion. Some had their phones raised, cameras pointed at the scene, but no one spoke up. No one stepped forward. Natalie's breathing remained steady, her eyes scanning what little she could see from the pavement. Faces, partially obscured by the glare of morning light, stood frozen on their porches, in driveways, on sidewalks. Some looked concerned, others wary, but none moved. She knew why. She had seen it before. Fear, not of the scene unfolding before them, but of what would happen if they got involved. A hand gripped her arm tightly, yanking her up from the pavement. The cuffs cut into her wrists as they pulled her onto her feet, her legs still weak beneath her. The younger officer, Mercer, was still wearing that smirk, though it had twisted into something sharper now, something edged with the satisfaction of power. "See what happens when you don't cooperate?" His voice was low, for her alone, his fingers tightening around her bicep as he leaned in just slightly. "You people never learn." Natalie's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Not yet. The older officer, Holloway, glanced at the crowd, eyes flicking between faces, reading the tension, the cameras, the way the energy in the air was shifting. He didn't like this. The attention, the scrutiny. They had expected submission, quick compliance, a quiet arrest with no questions. They hadn't expected an audience. He turned to Mercer. "Let's move her before this turns into something." Natalie was marched toward the police cruiser, her wrists still locked behind her, muscles aching with each forced step. She kept her head high, her expression unreadable, refusing to let them see anything but absolute control in her posture. She wouldn't let them see weakness. As she was guided toward the back seat, she caught the eye of an older black man standing just outside his house, phone in hand, his expression unreadable. She knew what he was thinking. That recording wouldn't change anything. That it had happened before. That it would happen again. The cruiser door opened, and Mercer shoved her inside with unnecessary force. She caught herself before she slammed into the opposite door, adjusting her balance, shifting her weight. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. From the window, she could still see them. The gathering of neighbors, the shifting unease, the way some people exchanged glances, but said nothing. She wasn't expecting anyone to fight for her. She had spent too many years fighting for herself to expect otherwise. Holloway slid into the driver's seat, Mercer beside him, their movements casual, routine, as if this was just another day. The radio crackled. Unit 37. En route? Holloway picked up the receiver, his tone businesslike. Affirmative. Bringing suspect in now. Suspect. That word sat heavy in the stale air of the back seat, wrapping itself around her like a chain, like an expectation. Mercer glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his smirk still lingering, fingers drumming against the dashboard. Gotta say, you made this a hell of a lot harder than it needed to be. Natalie didn't answer. She settled in, her mind already shifting gears, already moving past the moment, beyond the discomfort, beyond the ache in her muscles, beyond the ringing in her ears. This wasn't the first time she had been restrained. It was, however, the first time she had been restrained like this. The car pulled away from the curb, the neighborhood shrinking behind her. The murmurs of the crowd faded, replaced by the hum of the tires against the road. Mercer let out a short chuckle, glancing at Holloway. Bet you $20 she's got a record. Want a check? Holloway said nothing, his fingers tight around the wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Natalie turned her head slightly, looking through the barred partition. I hope you do check, she said, voice smooth, measured. Might learn something interesting. Mercer let out another laugh, shaking his head. Man, you really don't get it, do you? He turned, angling himself to get a better look at her through the partition. Doesn't matter what's on your record, doesn't matter who you are. You could be the damn president, and you'd still be sitting right where you are now. Natalie met his gaze, her expression calm. I know exactly who I am, she said simply. Mercer rolled his eyes and turned back around. Yeah? And where's that getting you? The cruiser continued down the road, the station looming in the distance, the weight of the cuffs against her wrists, the dull ache in her muscles, the quiet hum of the radio. All of it settled into her mind like pieces of a puzzle arranging themselves into place. She wasn't thinking about the station. She wasn't thinking about the booking process, the paperwork, the holding cell. She was thinking ahead. She was thinking about what happened after. The cold steel of the handcuffs had been removed, but the imprint of them still lingered on Natalie's skin. The dull ache in her wrists, a reminder of how quickly power could be abused. She sat in a small, windowless room at the police station, the walls a lifeless shade of gray, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her. The table in front of her was scratched, dented with years of use, its surface marred by old scuffs and deep-set scratches. It was the kind of room designed to make people feel small, to press them into silence with nothing but the weight of stale air and isolation. Natalie was neither small nor silent. She had been left in that chair for over an hour, with no explanation, no officer stepping in to formally charge her, no paperwork slid across the table demanding a signature, just deliberate waiting. The kind meant to wear a person down, to make them question whether pushing back was worth the fight. She had endured this tactic before, though in far worse places, under far worse circumstances. Sitting here, cuffed for jogging in her own neighborhood, was almost laughable in comparison. Almost. The door finally creaked open, and Holloway walked in, moving with the slow, measured confidence of a man who had done this more times than he could count. His uniform was crisp, his belt perfectly adjusted, every inch of him carrying the smug assurance of someone who believed himself untouchable. He pulled out the chair across from her, the metal scraping loudly against the tiled floor, and sat down, exhaling as though this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience for him rather than an outright abuse of authority. Well, he said, settling back in his chair, his voice thick with condescension, looks like you're clean. Natalie didn't react, her expression as unreadable as stone. Holloway tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one might a stray dog that refused to cower. He was testing her, waiting for a flinch, waiting for the moment she let frustration or fear slip through the cracks. He was going to be disappointed. You're free to go, he continued, lacing his fingers together in front of him. No charges. Just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Natalie let the words settle between them, as hollow and weightless as the excuse itself. She had been tackled, tased, and handcuffed in the middle of her own neighborhood, dragged here without cause, and now they expected her to walk away like it had been nothing more than an unfortunate mistake, a clerical error that could be brushed aside with a shrug. "You tased and arrested me because I was jogging," she said, her voice steady, controlled. Holloway's smirk didn't waver. "Because you refused to cooperate." There it was, the same justification, the same gaslighting, the same twisted narrative that always got spun in situations like this. The burden of compliance was always placed on the person being harassed, never on the officers doing the harassing. Natalie held his gaze, unmoving. Holloway leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as though offering a piece of well-intended advice. "Look, I'll be straight with you. This doesn't have to turn into a thing. You keep your head down, you won't have any more problems. But if you keep pushing, well," he let out a slow breath, shaking his head in mock sympathy. "We both know how that goes." Natalie's fingers curled slightly beneath the table, her nails pressing into her palm. She had been given warnings before, in war zones, in back rooms, in places where the stakes were life or death. She recognized veiled threats when she heard them. Her lips parted just enough for her next words to slip through, smooth and unwavering. "Are we done here?" Holloway exhaled, the amusement never leaving his face. "Yeah, we're done." Minutes later, she was walking out of the precinct, her belongings handed back to her with no apology, no acknowledgement that she had been wrongfully detained, just the smirking face of the desk sergeant as he slid them across the counter like she was some fool who had learned a lesson. But they had miscalculated. She wasn't the kind of woman who let things go. She was the kind of woman who took notes, who measured her responses, who studied her enemy before delivering the first strike. By the time she walked into the Internal Affairs Division the next morning, she had already gathered every detail she needed. She had spent the night combing through policy manuals, reviewing footage that neighbors had sent her, compiling every law and regulation that had been broken. She knew that the system rarely held its own accountable, that most complaints vanished into bureaucratic limbo, never to be seen again. But this wasn't about expecting justice. It was about making sure her name was on record, that Mercer and Holloway understood she wasn't going to let them rewrite the story. She sat across from a senior investigator, a weary-looking man in a navy suit, his tired eyes scanning her report as though he had read too many of them to believe any would lead to real consequences. When she finished recounting what had happened, he set his pen down, exhaling through his nose before folding his hands over the desk. "We'll review the footage and conduct an internal investigation," he said, voice neutral, almost mechanical. "If any violations are found, appropriate action will be taken." Natalie studied him. The way he said "if" rather than "when." The way his face gave away nothing, not even the smallest flicker of surprise. He had already decided how this would end. "We'll be in touch," he added, offering a thin, almost dismissive nod before standing. The meeting was over. Natalie left the building with no illusions. They would bury this. They would close ranks, protect their own, file her complaint away where no one would ever see it again. But that didn't matter, because she had just made her first move. Natalie had expected retaliation. She had seen enough of these cases, read enough reports, and heard enough stories to know exactly how the system protected its own. Officers like Holloway and Mercer didn't just walk away after someone like her filed a complaint. They wouldn't let it go unanswered. The goal wasn't to silence her in one swift motion. It was to wear her down, to send a message, to make her question whether it was worth pushing forward. It started small. At first, it was subtle enough that it could have been written off as coincidence. The morning after she filed the complaint, she found her trash bin overturned in her driveway, its contents scattered across the pavement, greasy food wrappers, shredded papers, and coffee grounds spilling onto the asphalt. She had stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before calmly grabbing a pair of gloves and cleaning it up. It wasn't enough to make her feel threatened, just annoyed. But it didn't stop there. A few days later, she noticed the scratch along the driver's side of her car. Deep, jagged, deliberate. At first, she had assumed it was just an accident. Maybe someone had parked too close. Maybe a stray shopping cart had scraped against it while she was in the grocery store parking lot. But then it happened again. This time, she found a fresh set of scratches along the trunk, deeper than before, like someone had taken their time, pressing the key in harder, dragging it across the paint with slow, methodical precision. The pattern was becoming obvious. It was no longer coincidence. It was a message. That night, she set up a motion-activated camera outside her garage, adjusting the angle carefully, making sure it covered the entire length of her driveway. She didn't expect to catch anything immediately, but she wasn't the type to sit back and wait. She would watch, observe, and gather evidence the same way she had done in hostile territories overseas. By the end of the week, it escalated again. Natalie woke early, stepping outside just as the first traces of dawn stretched across the sky, the cool morning air wrapping around her skin. As she walked toward her car, she felt it before she saw it. That prickle of awareness, the faint shift in energy that told her she wasn't alone. Then she spotted it. A car, dark, unmarked, parked further down the street. Not directly in front of her house, not close enough to be obvious, but positioned just well enough that it had a clear view of her home. It wasn't a neighbor's car. She knew every vehicle that came and went on her block, and she had never seen this one before. She paused, her gaze trailing over its tinted windows, the idling engine barely audible in the morning stillness. She waited a few seconds. 10, 15. Most people, if they were lost or looking for an address, would have moved by now. The car didn't move. She exhaled slowly, turning away, acting as if she hadn't noticed. But the moment she stepped back inside her house, she went straight to the front window, staying just out of sight, watching. The car remained there for another 20 minutes before finally rolling forward, creeping down the street at an unnatural pace, before disappearing around the corner. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. So, that's how they wanted to play it. She didn't react. Didn't call anyone, didn't let her routine change. That was part of the game. They wanted her rattled, wanted her to feel like she was always being watched. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. The unmarked car never parked in the same place twice, always shifting, always adjusting, never staying long enough to be called in as suspicious. But it was there, lingering just at the edges of her vision, a reminder that she was being observed. A week after filing her complaint, she came home late from the gym, the street quiet, most of the neighborhood already settled in for the night. As she pulled into her driveway, she caught something in her peripheral vision. Movement near the side of her house, a shadow, just for a split second, slipping out of view. She didn't panic. She killed the engine, sat still for a moment, listening. Nothing. Then, slowly, she reached for the small knife tucked beneath her seat, flipping it open with a silent, practiced motion before stepping out of the car. Her eyes scanned the yard, the edges of her property, every darkened corner where someone could be hiding. The motion light by her back fence flickered on. Something had triggered it, but as she stepped closer, there was no one there, just her trash bin. Rummaged through again. Natalie's jaw tightened. She crouched, sifting through the contents, noting what had been disturbed. They weren't looking for valuables. This wasn't random vandalism. Whoever had been here wasn't just making a mess. They had been searching for something. She picked up one of the torn envelopes, her name still visible on the corner. Bills, mail, paperwork. They were going through her personal information. Her fingers curled around the envelope, crumpling it slightly. Slow intimidation tactics. Standard playbook. She had seen it before. In war zones, in intelligence operations, in missions where fear was the first weapon deployed. This wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about making her afraid. She straightened, exhaling slowly, rolling her shoulders back before turning and walking toward her front door. she wasn't afraid. They wanted her to be on edge, wanted her to hesitate, wanted her to start questioning herself, questioning whether pushing forward was worth it. But they had underestimated the kind of woman they were dealing with. Because this wasn't making her afraid. It was making her angry. Natalie sat at her dining table, the soft glow of a single overhead light illuminating the papers in front of her. A collection of small, deliberate disturbances. The keyed car, the rummaged trash, the unmarked vehicle that lurked just outside her home. None of it was random. None of it was accidental. She had spent years analyzing patterns of psychological warfare. And this was textbook. Intimidation. It started with surveillance, letting the target know they were being watched, making them feel exposed. Then came minor disruptions, subtle, deniable acts that were enough to unsettle but never enough to prove intent. And finally, escalation. Direct warnings, the kind that left no doubt about their message. She had seen these tactics used against informants, against civilians in occupied territories, against anyone who needed to be controlled. And now, they were being used against her. Her phone vibrated, pulling her from her thoughts. Marcus. She exhaled, bracing herself before answering. Yeah, you still up? His voice was clipped, tight with barely contained frustration. I don't sleep much. A pause. Then, I heard about what's been happening. Of course, he had. Marcus had a way of knowing things before she even told him. As a defense attorney, he spent his days untangling legal webs, navigating the kind of corruption that people like to pretend didn't exist. He understood the weight of what she was dealing with. Talk to me, he said. Natalie leaned back in her chair, staring at the scratches on her car keys, her mind piecing together the timeline. They're watching me. That unmarked car is parked somewhere on my street almost every night. They've been going through my trash, looking for anything they can use. And now, she reached for the stack of envelopes on the table, flipping through them until she landed on the latest one. No return address, no postage stamp. Just her name. She slid her thumb under the flap, prying it open. A single sheet of paper. Blocky, uneven handwriting. Drop the complaint. Walk away. She exhaled slowly. Now I'm getting letters. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before he sighed. Nat, don't tell me to let this go. I'm telling you to be careful. He corrected. You know what happens when people go after cops. They don't play fair. She knew. She also didn't care. Marcus exhaled again, his voice quieter now. This could ruin you. I'm already ruined, she said flatly. Or haven't you noticed? They've already started the process. Her job. It had happened yesterday. An unexpected email from her contracting firm requesting an immediate review of her security clearance. Natalie had spent years working in counterterrorism, both in the field and in intelligence. Her clearance was everything. Without it, she couldn't work in defense consulting. She couldn't access the jobs that allowed her to transition into civilian life. The review wasn't random. They were trying to pull the rug out from under her. Marcus cursed under his breath. They put your clearance under review? Yeah, they're boxing you in. His voice was sharp now, tinged with something close to anger. If they pull your clearance, you lose your livelihood. You get blacklisted. Even if you win, you'll be radioactive. Natalie drummed her fingers against the table, her jaw tightening. It's not the first time someone's tried to burn me. And last time, you had the full weight of the military behind you. This time, you're alone. She let the silence settle between them. Marcus sighed. Just think about what happens next. You know I'll back you up, but you need to be smart. Natalie swallowed, nodding even though he couldn't see her. I'll handle it. Nat. She hung up before he could say anything else. Her gaze drifted back to the letter on the table. A warning. A desperate attempt to push her out of the fight before it got worse. Natalie had spent her entire career dealing with threats, with intimidation, with people who thought fear was enough to make someone disappear. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Natalie had never been the kind of woman to wait for an attack to finish before striking back. She had spent too many years learning how to turn the tide in impossible situations, how to take apart enemies not by force alone, but by precision. By understanding their weaknesses before they even realized they had been exposed. She had let Holloway and Mercer play their little game long enough. It was time to return the favor. She didn't go back to the police station. She didn't call internal affairs again. She didn't waste time pleading for justice from a system designed to protect the men who had put her on the pavement in cuffs. Instead, she made a call of her own. Angela Reyes picked up after the second ring. "Please tell me this isn't a social call." Natalie smirked slightly. Angela had been an intelligence officer in the Navy, working in cyber operations before leaving for private contracting. She was sharp, meticulous, and deeply unbothered by moral gray areas when it came to digging into people's lives. "Need some research done," Natalie said, keeping her voice even. Angela made a noise of amusement. "You don't do research. You do recon, which means someone pissed you off." Natalie leaned against her kitchen counter, staring out the window where, just as she expected, the unmarked car was back. A different spot tonight, half hidden behind another vehicle, but still there. Always there. "I filed a complaint against 2 cops, she said. "They responded by making my life hell. I need to know who they are, where they break the rules, what makes them nervous." Angela hummed thoughtfully. "Names? Holloway and Mercer. Brent Holloway. Doug Mercer, local PD." There was a brief pause, then the sound of typing, quick and fluid. The background hum of a woman who had done this 1,000 times before. "All right," Angela said after a moment. "I'll call you back when I have something." She hung up without another word. Natalie set her phone down and exhaled, rolling her shoulders. She had spent the last week reacting. It felt good to be the one making the first move. The weaknesses appear. Angela didn't take long. 3 hours later, her phone buzzed again. "You were right," Angela said, without preamble. "They've got skeletons." Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. "Talk to me. Holloway first," Angela said, her tone shifting into something more clinical. "He's been with the department for almost 20 years. On the surface, his record looks clean. Commendations, community outreach work, the usual PR nonsense. But when you start looking at his financials, things get interesting." Natalie's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "How interesting?" "He's involved in some off-the-books real estate deals. Properties flipping under shell LLCs. Cash deposits that don't quite match up with his salary. I don't have hard proof yet, but from what I'm seeing, he's either taking money under the table or running something dirty through those properties. Cops don't make enough to afford that many investments without help." That was good. That was very good. "And Mercer?" Angela snorted. "Mercer is just a mess. He's got a gambling problem. Nothing huge at first, but over the last 6 months, he's been bleeding money. Poker, online sports betting, underground stuff. He's in debt, and from the looks of it, he's in over his head. He's been making big withdrawals from his savings, but it's not covering what he owes." Natalie's mind was already working through the implications. Holloway was controlled, careful, the kind of man who wouldn't react unless he felt cornered. Mercer, though, if he was already desperate, he would break first. Angela sighed. "I can keep digging, but this is enough to work with." "It is." Angela hesitated. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. She knew what was coming. "This doesn't end clean," Angela said, her voice quieter now. "You know that, right?" Natalie opened her eyes, looking back at the shadowed car sitting just down the street, the same people who thought they could intimidate her into silence. She smiled, slow and deliberate. "I'm counting on it." Natalie didn't believe in luck. She believed in strategy, in patience, in knowing exactly where to apply pressure and watching the results unfold. Holloway was a careful man, someone who played by the rules just enough to keep himself clean while working in the margins where no one was supposed to look. That was his weakness. He thought he was untouchable. Men like him relied on the illusion of control. They built walls around their secrets, convinced themselves that as long as they followed their own rules, they would never be exposed. Holloway was smart, but he wasn't careful enough. He thought the power he wielded came from his badge, from the system that protected him. But Natalie had seen men like him fall before, not from loud public takedowns, but from the slow, creeping realization that their safety was nothing more than a lie they had told themselves. She started small. "Angela, I need a favor." The other woman sighed on the other end of the line, the sound of fingers flying over a keyboard in the background. "That's how all your calls start. What am I looking for? I want to hit Holloway where it hurts, but I don't want him to see the swing coming." A pause. Then, "Money?" Natalie smirked. "Always." Angela hummed thoughtfully, already scanning through records. "All right, let's see what your boy is hiding. Cops like him don't live on their salaries alone. They either have side hustles or they're getting kickbacks from somewhere. Give me a few hours." Natalie didn't need a few hours. She already knew. The first crack appeared in the form of an anonymous tip to a local investigative journalist. A simple email, untraceable, vague enough to stir interest but detailed enough to start the process. The article dropped the next morning, a quiet but deliberate ripple in the local news. No names, no direct accusations, just a headline that hinted at something rotten beneath the surface. Undisclosed property transfers raise questions about law enforcement, involvement in local real estate deals. It was the kind of thing that people dismissed until they didn't. Holloway's day started like any other. He walked into the precinct, nodded at the officers who greeted him, poured himself a cup of coffee from the half-empty pot in the break room. But by the time he got to his desk, the first email was already waiting. An internal memo from the department. A request for clarification on his financials. Not an accusation. Not yet. Just a small, insidious tug at the edges of his confidence. Natalie imagined the way his jaw clenched when he saw it. The slight stiffening of his shoulders as he realized someone was looking at things they weren't supposed to see. That was the first move. The second was more direct. 2 days later, Holloway arrived at one of his properties to find a "for sale" sign planted firmly in the front yard. He stood there for a moment, blinking in confusion, before irritation set in. He yanked the sign from the ground, inspecting it like it would tell him how it got there. His phone buzzed before he could even process the thought. "Yeah," he answered gruffly. "Brent? This is Mark over at Sunrise Realty. I just got a few inquiries about the listing on—" "There is no listing," Holloway cut in sharply. A pause. "Well, that's funny, because it's been posted on half a dozen real estate sites. Your name, your number attached." Holloway inhaled through his nose, already pulling up his phone, scrolling through search results. His fingers tightened around the device as he saw them. Multiple postings. Active listings with his personal contact information. "Take it down," he ordered, voice clipped. "I'm working on it," the realtor replied. "But listen, this is bad optics, man. You don't want people sniffing around, thinking you're dumping properties." Holloway didn't reply. He was already running through the list of people who could have done this. The seed of paranoia had been planted. But Natalie wasn't finished. The final move came late at night, at a property Holloway thought no one knew about. A rundown rental on the outskirts of town, buried under layers of LLCs. Quiet, unassuming. It was the kind of place that only mattered when you knew why it mattered. When he arrived, he knew something was wrong before he even stepped inside. The door wasn't broken, no windows shattered, but there was something. A presence, a weight in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He stepped in cautiously, his fingers twitching toward his belt, even though he knew he wouldn't find anything. Everything was as he left it, except for the folder on the kitchen counter. It wasn't there before. His pulse ticked up slightly as he approached, flipping it open with careful, deliberate fingers. Inside were pages of printouts. His property transactions, financial records, reports linked to his name, a copy of the article that had been published. And at the bottom, in simple, precise handwriting, a note. "How deep do you think they'll dig?" He stood there for a long moment, staring at the papers, his jaw tightening. He knew what this was. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. He didn't call it in. Didn't report a break-in. That would only lead to questions. Questions he wasn't prepared to answer. He didn't know how far this went. How much someone knew. How much more was coming. He only knew one thing. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was the one being watched. Natalie shifted her focus to Mercer next. Holloway was the planner, the one who played the long game. But Mercer, he was impulsive, sloppy, the kind of man who acted first and thought later. He followed orders because he wasn't smart enough to operate without them. He enjoyed the power his badge gave him, the way it let him push people around without consequences. But unlike Holloway, Mercer didn't know how to cover his tracks. His weaknesses were easier to find and even easier to exploit. She had already done the research. Angela had handed her everything she needed. Mercer had a gambling problem, one that had started small but had spiraled out of control over the last 6 months. He was in debt, the kind that didn't come with polite letters or final notices. It came with quiet threats and men who collected what was owed in flesh when money wasn't enough. Natalie didn't need to expose him publicly. She just needed to make sure that the people he owed started paying more attention. It began with a simple call. Angela had found the names of 2 loan sharks Mercer had been borrowing from. Men who operated just outside the law, but had enough influence to make life very difficult for those who didn't pay on time. She fed them just enough information. Mercer's badge number, his work schedule, the bank account he had drained trying to keep up with his losses. She didn't have to do anything else. The moment they realized a cop was stiffing them, they'd handle the rest. The paranoia started almost immediately. A week later, Mercer walked into the precinct looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usual cocky swagger was gone, replaced by tense shoulders and darting eyes. He flinched when his phone buzzed, staring at the screen for a moment too long before silencing it. His hands fidgeted constantly, rubbing at his jaw, tapping against his belt. Holloway noticed. Natalie could tell from the way he spoke to him. The quiet suspicion in his voice when he asked if Mercer was handling things. Mercer wasn't handling anything. Natalie made sure of that. The next move was more direct. She had been tracking his schedule, knew his routine just as well as she had known Holloway's. She knew that every Wednesday night, Mercer stopped at the same bar, a low-rent dive near the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions, where he could drink in peace and forget how deep he had sunk. She was waiting outside when he stumbled to his car. He was on edge, already checking over his shoulder, scanning for something he couldn't quite name. His paranoia made him sloppy. He fumbled his keys, dropping them onto the pavement, cursing under his breath as he bent to pick them up. The moment his back was turned, she stepped forward and slid a small folded note under his windshield wiper before vanishing into the shadows. She didn't have to wait long. As soon as he straightened, his gaze flicked to his car, his breath hitching when he noticed the paper tucked under the wiper. His hands were shaking as he grabbed it, unfolding the single sheet of paper. "You should pay what you owe before someone collects." Mercer's head snapped up, eyes scanning the empty lot, his body stiff with tension. His breathing was ragged, his fingers clutching the note so tightly that the paper crumpled in his grip. He turned in a slow circle, searching for someone, anyone, watching him. But Natalie was already gone. It didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Mercer's paranoia deepened. He started looking over his shoulder constantly, jumping at small sounds, snapping at his co-workers. He changed his routine, taking different routes to work, avoiding his usual haunts. He even skipped his Wednesday night bar trip, too afraid to go back. Then Natalie escalated further. Late one night, she slipped into the police parking lot and left a small package on the hood of Mercer's squad car. It wasn't anything dangerous, just a manila envelope filled with fake loan statements, overdue notices, numbers that painted the picture of a man drowning in debt with no way out. When he found it the next morning, his reaction was immediate. He tore the envelope open right there in the lot, his breathing shallow, his forehead glistening with sweat. His hands trembled as he shuffled through the papers, the color draining from his face. He was already at his breaking point. Natalie just needed to give him one last push, and she knew exactly how to do it. Mercer was unraveling. The once arrogant cop who had sneered down at Natalie as he tightened the cuffs around her wrists was now a man barely holding himself together. The paranoia was eating at him, his usual bravado stripped away by the mounting fear that he was being watched, that the people he owed money to weren't going to wait much longer. Natalie could see the cracks widening with each carefully placed move. The fake overdue notices, the anonymous warning under his windshield, the unshakable feeling that something was closing in on him. It had all worked exactly as she had planned. But Mercer wasn't the type to think his way through a problem. He was the kind of man who lashed out when he felt trapped, and Natalie needed him right on the edge before she gave him the final push. It happened late one evening, just after his shift ended. Mercer walked out of the precinct, head down, shoulders hunched. He had started keeping his hand near his belt more often, his fingers twitching toward his weapon like a nervous tick. He moved differently now, no longer the cocky enforcer who enjoyed throwing his weight around. He looked exhausted, worn thin by the constant tension of feeling hunted, but never seeing the predator. Natalie waited until he reached his car before she acted. The parking lot was mostly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Just as he unlocked his door, his phone rang. An unknown number. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation flickering in his features before he finally swiped to answer. "Yeah?" His voice was tight, laced with unease. Silence. Then, a distorted voice, low and grainy. "Your time's running out, Mercer." His breath hitched. "Who the hell is this?" No response. Just the sound of steady breathing on the other end. Mercer turned sharply, eyes scanning the lot, his free hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The line went dead. Natalie watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows of a nearby alley, her burner phone still clutched in her gloved hand. She had distorted her voice with a voice changer app, just enough to make it untraceable but menacing. Mercer was already on edge. She just needed to keep tightening the noose. He stood frozen by his car, breathing hard, eyes darting around like he expected someone to step out of the darkness. His paranoia was so consuming that he didn't even notice the small piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. When he finally spotted it, his movements were frantic. He yanked it free, his fingers trembling as he unfolded the note. "You know what happens to guys who don't pay their debts." Natalie watched as Mercer turned in a slow circle, his breathing ragged, his face twisted in desperation. He was losing it. She had seen it before, in war zones, in interrogation rooms, men who thought they were in control until the pressure became unbearable. Mercer climbed into his car, his hands gripping the wheel, his body rigid with tension. He didn't drive off immediately. Instead, he sat there, unmoving, as though trying to piece together how his life had spun so far out of control. Then, as if on cue, his phone rang again. This time, he didn't answer. He threw the device onto the passenger seat, cursing under his breath before finally peeling out of the lot, his tires screeching against the pavement. Natalie waited a few seconds before stepping out of the shadows. She had just planted the final seed. Mercer wasn't just afraid anymore. He was desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. Mercer's paranoia reached its peak faster than Natalie had anticipated. She had expected him to crack, but she hadn't expected it to happen this spectacularly. The pressure had been building for weeks, each move chipping away at his already fragile sense of control. Now, he was a man barely keeping himself together, his once cocky demeanor replaced by erratic, jittery movements and a hair-trigger temper. It all came to a head on a quiet Thursday evening. Natalie had been tracking his movements, watching as he changed his routine, doubling back on his own routes, and scanning his surroundings like a man expecting an attack. He wasn't sleeping much, and it showed in the dark circles beneath his eyes, the way his shoulders stayed tense, even when he was sitting still. That night, he left the precinct earlier than usual, avoiding the usual after-shift bars and heading straight home. But he never made it inside. As soon as he stepped out of his car, he noticed a figure across the street. Natalie watched from a distance, unseen, as Mercer's entire body went rigid. The man wasn't doing anything suspicious, just standing near a parked sedan, looking down at his phone. But in Mercer's unraveling mind, it was confirmation of everything he had been dreading. Someone was following him. Someone was waiting for him to slip up. He reached for his gun without hesitation. "Hey!" he barked, voice sharp and cracking slightly, as he stalked toward the man, his weapon now fully drawn, shaking just enough to be noticeable. "Hands where I can see them!" The man barely had time to react before Mercer was on him, pressing the barrel against his chest. "What the hell do you want?" Mercer's voice was frantic now, his breathing ragged, his entire body coiled like a live wire. The man lifted both hands slowly, his eyes calm despite the weapon aimed at him. "Detective Julian Reyes, Organized Crime Unit." His tone was smooth, controlled, his badge gleaming under the dim glow of the streetlights. Mercer blinked, his grip on the gun faltering for just a second. Then reality crashed down on him. He had just pulled a weapon on an undercover investigator. Reyes held his position, his expression unreadable. "You want to lower that before we both regret it?" Mercer took a step back, his breathing still uneven, his hands shaking as he holstered the gun with unsteady fingers. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, trying and failing to mask the panic in his voice. Reyes didn't move. "Working a case." A pause. Then, "Not everything is about you, Officer Mercer." But that was the problem. In Mercer's mind, everything was about him. The paranoia had eaten away at whatever sense of reason he had left, and now he had made the kind of mistake that couldn't be easily erased. By the time news of the incident reached the precinct, Holloway had already started spiraling in his own way. Unlike Mercer, he wasn't erratic. He was the kind of man who kept things bottled up, convinced he could drink away his problems until they stopped feeling like problems at all. But Natalie knew better. She had seen it before. Men who thought they could drown their demons in whiskey, only to find that those demons could swim. And Holloway was drowning fast. It started with the small things: missed calls, paperwork errors, showing up late to roll call. But then came the fight. A local bar. The kind where men like Holloway went to drink alone. The kind where no one asked questions when a cop stumbled in looking for something stronger than what was in his glass. He had been on his third round when a man at the other end of the bar made an offhand comment about the police. Something vague, something meant more as a joke than an insult. Holloway didn't take it that way. No one knew who threw the first punch. But by the time it was over, Holloway was on the ground, blood trickling from his lip, his badge barely still clipped to his belt. His suspension was announced the next day. Natalie watched it all unfold with the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing her plan was working. Mercer had just torched his reputation, and Holloway had let his temper make the decision for him. Neither of them was thinking clearly anymore. Every move they made now would be dictated by fear, by anger, by the suffocating weight of not knowing who was pulling the strings. She should have felt like she had won. But Marcus had a different opinion. "You're walking a fine line, Nat." His voice carried through the phone, low and serious in a way that made her pause. She sat on her couch, staring out at the street, watching as the unmarked car that had been shadowing her for weeks was nowhere to be found tonight. They had other things to worry about now. "I'm handling it," she said evenly. Marcus sighed. "Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you're pushing them exactly where you want them. But what happens when they push back? They already did. And what happens when they go further?" Natalie didn't answer immediately. She had been so focused on making them feel the fear they had tried to instill in her that she hadn't stopped to consider the endgame. She had been in control from the moment she started this, but control was a slippery thing. If they got desperate enough, reckless enough, she wouldn't be the only one pulling the strings anymore. Marcus sighed again, softer this time. "You sure you're ready for whatever comes next?" She watched the street for another moment, her fingers tightening around the edge of the couch. "Yeah," she murmured. "I am." Mercer was crumbling, but it wasn't enough. Natalie had watched as the paranoia seeped into every part of his life, turning his once arrogant swagger into a jittery, nervous wreck. He had already lost his reputation within the department after pulling his gun on an undercover investigator. The gambling debts had finally caught up to him, and now the men he owed were circling, waiting for their payment. His resignation had been the final sign of defeat. He thought quitting the force would keep him safe, that disappearing from the spotlight would stop the inevitable. But Natalie wasn't done yet. He had spent years hiding behind his badge, wielding it like a weapon against those he deemed beneath him. He had terrorized people, knowing the system would protect him, that complaints would be buried, that his uniform would shield him from consequences. His gambling problem had made him vulnerable, but Natalie wanted him to feel something deeper. She wanted him to feel what it was like to be truly powerless. She started with the bullet casing. It was a simple message, placed carefully on the hood of his car, positioned so that he would see it the moment he stepped outside his apartment. Alongside it, a single note written in clear, bold letters. "You won't see it coming." The reaction was immediate. From her concealed spot across the street, Natalie watched as Mercer stepped out into the cold night air, his head down, rubbing his temples like he was nursing another hangover. His movements were sluggish, unfocused, until his eyes locked onto the bullet casing. His entire body went rigid. His fingers twitched at his sides, hesitant to even touch the small, harmless piece of metal sitting there like a death sentence. His eyes darted around wildly, scanning the empty lot, searching the shadows, his breath hitching in short, erratic bursts. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, raw with exhaustion and fear. Natalie remained silent. Mercer swallowed hard, grabbing the casing with shaky fingers, flipping it over in his palm like he expected it to reveal an answer. His head snapped up again, and his hand instinctively went to his hip, only to find that there was nothing there. No gun, no badge, no authority to fall back on. She let him stew in the fear for a little longer, before stepping forward, just enough for him to see her. His breath left him in a sharp exhale, his body stiffening as recognition settled in. "You," his voice barely came out, hoarse and filled with disbelief. Natalie didn't give him time to recover. She moved fast, closing the distance between them before he could process what was happening. A brutal, calculated strike to his ribs sent him stumbling back against his car, wheezing as pain shot through his body. His hands flailed, trying to steady himself, but she was already on him again, driving a knee into his stomach. He gasped, doubling over, his forehead pressing against the cold metal of the car door. "You like putting people on the ground, don't you?" Her voice was calm, measured, the same way his had been the night he and Holloway arrested her. "Let's see how you like it." Before he could recover, she swept his legs out from under him. His body hit the pavement hard, his head bouncing slightly against the concrete. He groaned, rolling onto his side, coughing violently. "Stop!" She crouched beside him, grabbing his collar and yanking him up just enough so that their faces were inches apart. "You think I don't know who you are," she said, her voice low, almost conversational. "You think I didn't find out about every single person you harassed, every complaint you buried, every report that got lost?" His bloodshot eyes widened slightly, panic flashing across his face. "I have all of it," she continued, tightening her grip. "Every excessive force complaint, every misunderstanding that ended with you beating someone down because you thought no one would hold you accountable. You," he coughed, his breath shallow, "you don't know." She let go abruptly, letting his head hit the pavement again. "You should turn on the news in the morning," she said, standing up. "Maybe you'll see some familiar names." Mercer wheezed, his chest rising and falling unevenly, but she didn't wait for him to recover. She reached into her pocket and dropped something beside him. Another bullet casing. This time, he flinched. "You're gonna spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder," she said, her tone almost soft. "And the best part? You'll never know if I'm actually there." She turned and walked away, her footsteps steady, unhurried. She didn't need to look back to know that Mercer wasn't getting up any time soon. By the next morning, his name was all over the news. Former officer under fire as past complaints resurface. Ex-cop accused of excessive force in previously buried cases. His victims were finally being heard. The stories he had tried to erase were now the top headlines. His former colleagues refused to comment. The department scrambled to distance itself from him. Mercer was done. And Natalie? She finally got what she wanted. Mercer was crumbling. But it wasn't enough. Natalie had watched as the paranoia seeped into every part of his life, turning his once arrogant swagger into a jittery, nervous wreck. He had already lost his reputation within the department after pulling his gun on an undercover investigator. The gambling debts had finally caught up to him, and now the men he owed were circling, waiting for their payment. His resignation had been the final sign of defeat. He thought quitting the force would keep him safe, that disappearing from the spotlight would stop the inevitable. But Holloway was different. Mercer was weak, reactive, easy to manipulate. Holloway was calculating. He had spent years mastering the system, skirting the rules while keeping his hands clean. He knew how to play the game, how to make people disappear from records, how to ensure that complaints never saw the light of day. Even after his suspension, after the bar fight, he still believed he could fix things. That all he needed was time and the right connections to pull himself back up. Natalie wasn't going to give him that chance. She had already planted the seeds of his downfall. Internal Affairs was watching him now, the whispers of his real estate schemes getting louder, the kind of scrutiny that wouldn't just vanish with a well-placed favor. But he needed to feel it. She wanted to see the moment the control he clung to so desperately slipped from his grasp, and she knew exactly where to hit him. It started with his money. Holloway had hidden his real estate dealings behind a web of LLCs, each one designed to keep his name off the books, while he funneled cash through fraudulent property sales. But Angela had untangled everything. With the right digital breadcrumbs and a few well-placed tips, she had made sure that the IRS started sniffing around, that the city's property fraud unit took a second look at some of his transactions. A single anonymous report had been sent directly to his bank. A freeze on his accounts followed shortly after. Holloway didn't panic. Not at first. He assumed it was a mistake, an error he could sort out. But then came the calls, the inquiries, the letters from investigators requesting meetings. His empire, built on carefully constructed lies, was beginning to collapse. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, Natalie made sure it did. She waited for the right night, watching his patterns, tracking his movements. His drinking had become a problem. He was spending more nights out, trying to dull the stress with whiskey, trying to convince himself that he was still in control. But he wasn't thinking clearly anymore. She followed him after he left one of his usual bars, his gait uneven, his posture tense. He walked with his head down, lost in his own thoughts, too distracted to notice that she was closing in. Then she struck. The first hit landed clean. A precise, brutal punch to his ribs that sent him stumbling sideways into the alley beside the bar. He grunted in pain, one hand instinctively going to his side as he wheeled around. "What the hell?" She drove her fist into his gut, cutting off his words. He gasped, doubling over, eyes wide with shock. He was slow, too slow, his reflexes dulled from the alcohol. But even if he had been sober, he wouldn't have been fast enough. "You always liked throwing people around, didn't you?" she said, her voice eerily calm. "Let's see how you handle it." Holloway snarled, trying to swing at her, but she ducked easily, slamming her knee into his ribs before grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back. He let out a strangled curse, his body jerking in resistance, but she had him locked. He was strong, but she was trained. "Still think you're the one in charge?" she murmured against his ear. "You," his voice was strained, laced with fury and desperation. You think this is gonna change anything? She wrenched his arm higher, making him choke on his own breath. Oh, it already has. With a final shove, she slammed him against the alley wall, his chest colliding with the brick. He groaned, his forehead pressing against the rough surface as he tried to steady himself. You think I don't know what you've been doing? She continued, her voice low. All the people you screwed over? The complaints you made disappear? The businesses you crushed just so you could turn a profit? His breathing was labored now, his face twisted in pain. You don't have proof, he spat. Natalie smirked. You'll see for yourself in the morning. She let him go, watching as he stumbled forward, barely managing to stay on his feet. He turned to face her, his lip curled in a sneer, but she could see it. The flicker of uncertainty. The realization that she wasn't bluffing. She reached into her pocket and tossed something at his feet. A crumpled newspaper. Holloway hesitated before glancing down, his face darkening as he read the headline, Corrupt Real Estate Deals Linked to Suspended Officer Brent Holloway. His past, his secrets, everything he had built was now public knowledge. He staggered back, his hands trembling at his sides. You don't know what you've done, he whispered. Natalie stepped closer, meeting his gaze. I know exactly what I've done. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the alley, his entire world crashing down around him. By morning, his name was everywhere. Investigations into his real estate fraud had been officially launched. His properties were under review, his bank accounts frozen, his legal troubles piling up. The department refused to acknowledge him, distancing themselves as quickly as possible. 2 days later, he submitted his resignation. A week after that, he was gone. Natalie watched as the moving truck pulled out of his driveway, as Holloway disappeared from the city he had once controlled so easily. It was over. He had spent years manipulating the system, avoiding consequences, hurting people without a second thought. Now, he was just another disgraced ex-cop running from the mess he had created. And Natalie? She had made sure he never forgot who put him there. Natalie stood on her porch, arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching as the moving truck pulled out of Holloway's driveway. He was behind the wheel of his car, following closely behind, his shoulders hunched forward, like a man carrying the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. There was no ceremony, no final attempt at bravado, no last look over his shoulder, no lingering defiance. Just a man who had lost, leaving behind everything he had built, everything he had controlled for so long. She had been there when he had power. Now, she was here, as he drove away, with nothing. For the first time in weeks, she let herself exhale. It was done. The neighborhood felt different already, lighter, no longer stained by his presence. The creeping anxiety she had carried with her, the feeling of being watched, of waiting for the next move, was gone. The street was quiet, calm in a way it hadn't been since the night everything started. A car door shut behind her, the familiar weight of footsteps approaching across the pavement. You actually gonna enjoy this moment? Or are you already planning your next war? Natalie smirked without turning around. You always gotta ruin the mood, Angela? Angela stepped up beside her, her posture relaxed, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. The night was still, the only sound the distant hum of a passing car blocks away. Unlike Natalie, she wasn't watching the truck disappear down the street, taking Holloway with it. She was watching her. You won, Angela said, her tone even, unreadable. You took down 2 dirty cops and made them feel every second of it. That's gotta feel good. Natalie tilted her head slightly, considering the words before responding. It does. Angela nodded, but her expression didn't shift. And yet, you're still standing out here like you're expecting something else to happen. Natalie didn't answer, because the truth was, she was expecting something. Maybe not from Holloway or Mercer. They were finished. But from something else. The world had never let her rest for long. There was always another battle. Another war waiting in the shadows. She had spent her life in conflict, whether in uniform or here, in a city that had never fully accepted her. Peace had always been fleeting, a temporary pause between fights, never a permanent state. Angela sighed, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. You did what needed to be done. But you know this doesn't change the bigger picture, right? Natalie's fingers tapped lightly against her arm, the movement slow, thoughtful. Yeah, Angela studied her for a moment before shaking her head. Just don't let the fight become the only thing you know how to do. That made Natalie glance over, her smirk softening slightly. You sound like Marcus. Angela snorted. Well, now I'm insulted. Natalie huffed a quiet laugh, but the weight in Angela's words settled deep, pressing against something she didn't quite want to acknowledge yet. It wasn't that she had never thought about it before. She had. The idea that maybe, at some point, she wouldn't have to keep fighting. That she could just exist without constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next battle to begin. But when had that ever been true? Even before Mercer and Holloway, even before the military, the world had never given her the luxury of just being. She wasn't sure she even knew what that felt like anymore. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching as the taillights of Holloway's car finally disappeared around the corner. A permanent departure. No lingering threats, no chance of him turning around for one last show of power. He was gone. For good. Angela exhaled, stretching her arms over her head, her posture shifting into something looser, less burdened. All right. Now that your revenge tour is over, I'm getting food. You coming? Or are you just gonna stand here all night like Batman? Natalie shook her head, her lips curving just slightly. I'll catch up. Angela gave her a look, the kind that carried meaning without words, but didn't push further. Instead, she clapped her on the shoulder, the gesture grounding, familiar. Don't go looking for another fight, she called over her shoulder as she headed toward her car. At least not tonight. Natalie didn't reply, because she wasn't sure she knew how to stop. Minutes later, another car pulled up, its headlights briefly illuminating the street before flicking off. The engine idled for a moment. Then the driver's side door opened. Marcus stepped out, his gaze drifting toward Holloway's empty house, the for sale sign still planted in the front yard, like a final, silent declaration that he was never coming back. His lips pressed into a thin line as he took in the sight before turning his attention to Natalie. He didn't look angry. He didn't look relieved, just resigned. He climbed the porch steps slowly, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his movements careful, as if weighing the words he hadn't yet spoken. When he finally reached her, he stopped beside her, staring out into the quiet street. You did it, he said simply. Natalie nodded once. Yeah. Silence stretched between them, the weight of everything unspoken settling into the night air. Marcus exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face before shaking his head. You know I can't say I approve of all this, he muttered, his voice edged with something between exhaustion and reluctant understanding. I know. He glanced at her then, his expression unreadable. He had always been the moral compass, the one who tried to walk the right path even when the system was flawed, even when the rules didn't work in their favor. But even he knew that sometimes the rules weren't enough. But, he continued, his voice quieter now, I get it. That was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she was going to get, and she knew it. Natalie tilted her head, studying him for a moment. So, dinner? Marcus let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, all right, but you're paying. Figured. As he turned to head back to his car, she lingered on the porch, watching him walk across the pavement, his shoulders still heavy with everything that had happened. She could tell he wanted to say more. That maybe a part of him was relieved Holloway and Mercer were finally gone, but he wasn't the kind of man who would admit it. He still believed in accountability, in a justice system that, despite its flaws, was supposed to do the right thing. But they both knew that justice had never been meant for people like them. She stayed where she was, letting the stillness of the night settle over her. The street was calm, quieter than it had been in weeks. No unmarked cars parked outside, no messages scrawled on her door, no shadow of a threat looming just beyond reach. She finally felt safe, but she was still ready. She didn't regret what she had done. There were no second thoughts, no guilt gnawing at the edges of her mind. She had done what needed to be done, and she had done it on her terms. She had survived worse, and she knew better than to believe peace would last forever. Natalie let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the railing of the porch before she turned. Stepping inside, she locked the door behind her, the click of the deadbolt settling into place with quiet finality. If trouble came again, she would be ready. Because if life had taught her anything, it was that peace never lasted for long. The neighborhood was different now. It wasn't something obvious, not a change people would immediately recognize if they didn't know what had happened. The streets still looked the same, the houses stood as they always had, and the people who lived here still went about their daily lives, walking their dogs, watering their lawns, waving to their neighbors. But there was something quieter in the air, something settled. Natalie jogged through her usual route, her strides even, her breath controlled. It was the same path she had taken the morning Holloway and Mercer had stopped her, the same stretch of road where they had humiliated her, cuffed her, accused her of being something she was not. The last time she had been here, she had been treated like she didn't belong. Now, there was no one left to question her presence. She moved freely, her body relaxed, the tension that had once coiled in her muscles absent, the paranoia that had crept into her daily life, the feeling of always being watched, always being one step away from another confrontation. It was gone. The street belonged to her as much as it did anyone else, and there was no one left to make her feel otherwise. She kept running, her pace steady, her focus forward. By the time she reached her own house, the sun had started to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the porch steps. She slowed her movements, stretching her arms as she took in the quiet around her. There was no car parked just down the block, no unmarked vehicle lingering outside her house, no messages scrawled across her door in crude warnings. For the first time in weeks, she felt what it was like to be truly alone, free of threats, free of the constant weight pressing down on her shoulders. She stepped onto the porch, feeling the solid wood beneath her feet, then reached for the door. As she turned the lock, a faint smile ghosted across her lips, not one of triumph, not of celebration, but of knowing. Because while Holloway and Mercer had spent years believing they could act without consequences, believing that no one could ever touch them, they had learned that some fights couldn't be avoided, and some people they weren't meant to lose. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.